Cincinnati on a gloomy afternoon. The air was damp, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen, mixed with the aroma of fast food. J.D. Vance walked along the sidewalk, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, dressed simply, blending in with the hurried crowd. But even without the polished attire of a politician, he couldn't entirely disappear. A few passers-by whispered. Some recognized him from the news, their eyes glancing at him with curiosity. Amid the ceaseless flow of the city, a raspy voice cut through the noise from the curb. "Hey, man, got $1 to spare?" Vance stopped, turning toward the man who had spoken. He stood pressed against the wall of an old storefront, his clothes patched together, his shoes worn and tattered. But there was no desperation in his eyes, just the exhaustion of someone who had grown too accustomed to being ignored. Vance glanced around. The pedestrians paid no attention to the exchange. It was just another routine moment, a homeless man asking for money and a politician with the chance to appear generous. But Vance didn't immediately reach for his wallet. He didn't walk away, nor did he refuse. Instead, he did something that Jimmy, the homeless man, didn't expect. "What's your name?" Jimmy blinked, momentarily thrown off. Usually, people had only two reactions. They either walked away or tossed some change without looking. But Vance wasn't rushing. He stood there, waiting for an answer. And suddenly, the moment took an unexpected turn. Jimmy hesitated, clearly caught off guard. No one had ever asked for his name before. Typically, they either ignored him or, if they were feeling generous, threw a crumpled bill into his hand and turned away without a second glance. But J.D. Vance was still standing there, his eyes holding no pity, no judgment. "Jimmy," he muttered, his voice hoarse, as if it had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him. Vance nodded, as if making a mental note of the name. He glanced around, noticing a few bystanders slowing their pace, curious about the unusual sight of a politician stopping to talk to a homeless man instead of walking past like everyone else. But Vance didn't seem to care. "Have you been around here long?" Jimmy let out a dry chuckle and shrugged. "Doesn't really matter where you live when you don't have a home. I sleep wherever there's shelter, eat whatever I can find. Today it's Cincinnati, tomorrow could be somewhere else." This time Vance didn't just listen, he observed. Jimmy's hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his tattered coat, as if trying to hold on to what little warmth he could. His shoes, their soles nearly worn through, were no match for the city's cold nights. But there was something different about him. Jimmy didn't look like a man who had given up. There was no evasive glance, no resignation that often lingered in the eyes of the homeless. There was still something there, a flicker of pride, a piece of himself that hadn't been entirely lost. Vance crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "What did you do before this?" Jimmy furrowed his brow, as if debating whether he should answer, but in the end he sighed. "I used to be a plumber, but who's gonna hire a guy with no address, no phone?" A long silence settled between them. Jimmy was used to rejection, to meaningless, sympathetic nods. But this time Vance didn't walk away. Instead, he took a step closer, locking eyes with Jimmy. "Do you want to change that?" His words weren't just a question. They were an opportunity, and Jimmy felt it immediately. Jimmy said nothing. J.D. Vance's question hung in the air amid the city's noisy backdrop, as if waiting for an answer that wasn't easy to give. "Do you want to change that?" A simple question, yet it carried a weight Jimmy hadn't faced in years. He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Easy for you to say. You think I haven't tried? No one wants to hire a guy with no address, no phone, nothing." Vance didn't argue right away. Instead, he slowly pulled his hands from his pockets and took out a small piece of paper, holding it out toward Jimmy. "This is the number of someone I know. He owns a plumbing company in Dayton. He doesn't care where you live. He only cares if you can do the work." Jimmy stared at the paper but didn't reach for it. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What is this? Some kind of joke? A setup to make me look like an idiot in front of everyone?" Around them, a few passers-by had stopped, watching the exchange. A man in a baseball cap near the traffic light gave a small nod as if waiting to see how Vance would respond. But Vance didn't flinch. He met Jimmy's gaze head-on, his voice unwavering. Not everyone wants to see you fail. But the real question is, do you want to give yourself a chance? Jimmy pressed his lips together, his gaze wavering. He wanted to believe, but belief was a luxury for people like him. He had heard too many empty promises before, had reached for opportunities only to see them vanish the moment he tried to grasp them. A voice rang out from the crowd, filled with skepticism. He's just putting on a show, isn't he? A politician handing out opportunities on the street sounds like a performance. Both Jimmy and Vance heard it, but only Jimmy turned to look. He saw the doubtful eyes, the shaking heads, the smirks. People didn't believe in him, and they didn't believe in Vance's promise either. Vance remained still, his hand extended, the small piece of paper unmoving. You can believe it or not, but I'm not taking this offer back. Jimmy swallowed hard. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a choice. He stared at the slip of paper in J.D. Vance's hand. The faded numbers on that tiny scrap could be an opportunity, or just another promise that would dissolve like all the others. He had put his faith in good words before, only to be betrayed by harsh reality. Vance's words sounded sincere, but was there really a difference this time? A voice from the crowd cut through the air like a blade. He's just acting. When the cameras are off, you'll still be right here. A few others nodded in agreement, their skeptical eyes locked onto Jimmy as if waiting for him to throw the paper away, proving that this was all just a farce. Jimmy clenched his jaw. He hated this feeling, being looked down on, being judged, as if he had no right to make a choice for himself. But then he realized something. This moment was his, not theirs, not the bystanders who stood on the sidelines and judged. He took a deep breath, his shaky hands slowly reaching out, taking the paper from Vance's grasp. A strange silence fell over the crowd. A few whispered, some crossed their arms and shook their heads. But Jimmy didn't care anymore. This wasn't about them. This was about whether he had the courage to try again. Vance gave him a knowing nod, as if he understood Jimmy had just crossed an important threshold. That's all I can do. The rest is up to you. Jimmy clenched the paper in his fist, feeling its weight. Not in material value, but in meaning. For the first time in a long while, he had something to hold on to, an opportunity, a choice. And this time, he decided he wasn't going to let it slip away so easily. The rough texture of the paper grounded him in reality, a number, a chance, a way out. But then a dry chuckle echoed from behind him. You really think a scrap of paper can change your whole life? A middle-aged man in the crowd crossed his arms, his cold eyes filled with doubt. I've seen this before. A politician pretending to care, a homeless guy thinking he's about to be saved, and a few weeks later nothing changes. Jimmy swallowed hard. The man's words struck at the deepest fear within him. Yes, he had tried before, he had believed before, and he had been let down before. But this time, was it any different? Was this truly an opportunity or just another loop of failure? J.D. Vance didn't respond immediately. He looked at Jimmy not with pity, but with patience. People can say whatever they want, Vance finally said, his voice steady. But the most important question isn't what they think, it's what you think. Jimmy took a deep breath. Around him, expectant eyes waited for him to give up. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't care about that. He didn't care about their skepticism or his past failures. He only cared about one thing. Was he willing to take this step? He stuffed the slip of paper into his pocket. I'll try. Vance nodded, a faint smile appearing, not because he had saved someone, but because Jimmy had finally chosen to save himself. Jimmy walked away from the crowd, his steps heavy as if he were treading a path he had never dared to take before. In his pocket, the small slip of paper and the phone Vance had given him remained, a reminder that this opportunity was real. But was it? A part of him still screamed with doubt. He walked through the old streets, past cracked sidewalks that had witnessed every one of his past failures. A year ago he had a chance too, a promising job. But soon after, life dragged him back down. One mistake, one slip, and he was back to square one. Would this time be any different? Jimmy stopped in front of a small cafe, staring at the phone in his hand. Dial the number or not? One call could change everything. Or it could be just another cruel joke played by life. In his mind, the man from the crowd sneered, "You really think a scrap of paper can change your whole life?" Just as he was about to shove the phone back into his pocket, another voice echoed, Vance's voice. People can say whatever they want, but the most important question isn't what they think, it's what you think. Jimmy took a deep breath, then he did something even he hadn't expected. He dialed the number. A long ring, his heart pounded, and then a voice answered on the other end. "Hello, Jimmy. I've been waiting for your call." Jimmy clenched the phone tighter, his breath uneven as he heard those words. "Hello, Jimmy. I've been waiting for your call." The voice was steady, without doubt or pity, only certainty. Jimmy swallowed, torn between hope and the familiar fear of disappointment. "You really have a job for me?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of hesitation. The man on the other end chuckled lightly. "Not just a job, an opportunity. We have a position for a plumber, but the real question is, are you ready to start over?" Ready. That word echoed in Jimmy's mind like a challenge. He thought about all the times he had failed, all the times he had promised himself he would get back up, only to fall again. But this time was different. This time, someone had given him a way forward. And now, he had to decide whether to take it. I'll be there." The words left his lips before he could overthink them. A sigh of relief came from the other end, as if the man had been expecting that answer. "The address is in the message. Tomorrow, 7 a.m. Don't be late." The call ended, but Jimmy's hand was still trembling. He looked down at his phone where the message glowed on the screen, an address, a time. One call had changed everything. But did he have the strength to walk through that door? Jimmy's story is not just about a man finding a second chance. It is about the internal battle between fear and hope, a struggle that everyone will face at least once in their lifetime. When confronted with a new opportunity, many of us, like Jimmy, carry the scars of past failures, afraid that everything will collapse once again. The biggest lesson from this story is that change only begins when we choose to take action. We may hesitate, we may doubt ourselves, but if we never take that step forward, we will remain stuck in the same cycle of failure. Don't let fear control your decisions. Don't let the doubts of others define your worth. Remember, opportunities don't always come around, but when they do, the most important thing is whether you are willing to seize them. Whether you're facing a major decision or a small change in your life, ask yourself, am I willing to move forward despite my fear? If the answer is yes, then take action, because only by taking that step will you ever know how far you can go.